Hey, we already have quite some participants who've been joining, so I'm happy to start the webinar for today, the November edition of the Forest Restoration Talks, jointly organized by the Superb Project and IUFRO's former task force on transforming forest landscapes for future climates and human well-being. And today we have a really interesting topic as always, but today it's particularly interesting because it's a kind of summary and lessons learned from cost action called Bottoms Up, where more than 100 researchers were involved collecting biodiversity data. And the topic of today is the multi-taxon approach for biodiversity conservation and management. And we have 3 speakers, which I'm going to introduce in a minute. Next slide, please. I will start with some housekeeping as always. Oh, introducing myself, I forgot it. I'm Gesche Schifferdecker, Communications Manager at EFI and also Comms Manager in Superb. And as always, this webinar is being recorded, which also means you can share it afterwards with your colleagues in case you think that might be relevant for those who cannot join today. The recording will be available via EFI's YouTube account and on the IUFRO website. And we will share the link through social media like LinkedIn, etc. If you have questions, even throughout the presentation that we will listen to in a couple of minutes, please put them in the dedicated Q&A box that you can see on the bottom of the Zoom. And then after the presentation, we will approach you to ask the questions live. In case you don't want to, just let us know. But it would be really nice and also more interactive to create this kind of atmosphere where we have a panel, but also participants contributing to the discussions, just like we were in a room together. And if you want to it's not tweeting anymore, if you want to X about the webinar, then please make sure to tag us. And now I am very happy to introduce our first presenter today, Sabina Burrascano. She's an associate professor of environmental and applied botany at the Sapienza University in Rome. And she has a PhD in ecological sciences. And she is the chair or she was the chair of the former cost action Bottoms Up, and she's the deputy of the IUFRO unit on key factors and ecological functions for forest biodiversity. And I'm really looking forward to your presentation, Sabina.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Should I already start with my presentation?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Please share the slides.
I thought you were starting with introducing the other participants.
I can do that actually. If you could spotlight them as well, Priscilla, then I do that while Sabina is sharing the slides. Our second speaker today who will join the panel discussion is Flora Tinya. She's a biologist with a PhD in ecology from Edvus Laurent University in Budapest, Hungary. And she currently works as a research fellow at Hungary Center for Ecological Research. And we also have Yoan Paillet, who is a researcher at the National French Institute for Agriculture, Food and Environment in Grenoble, France, INRAE. And he works at the interface between forest biodiversity and management with a special interest in indicators and biodiversity-friendly measures set up by practitioners. So there's always a link to practitioners. And that's also what I'm enjoying a lot about Bottoms Up. So now I'm curious to learn more about the project, and all the speakers today have been involved in the project and can tell us more then also after Sabina's presentation. And now, Sabina, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting us and for your presentation. So you already introduced, we are going to share the results of our cost action that is now over, that is called Bottoms Up, and that was run since 2019 up to 2024. So my presentation is on behalf, obviously, of the Bottoms Up consortium. So let's start from definitions. How do we usually define forest biodiversity? In all the definitions, we see that is underscored how we should not only account for the diversity of tree species, but we should account for the diversity of all organisms in a forest. And this is true, for instance, in the definition of the Convention on Biological Diversity and in the FAO definition. And this is also very reasonable because really the other organisms other than trees in a forest make the most of the diversity that is hosted therein. And also we have other reasons to study forest biodiversity that come from, for instance, from the policies that we have at the European level. For instance, the new forest strategy for 2030 that has among the main goals to protect and enhance the biodiversity of European forests, but also the biodiversity strategy for 2030 that mentions forests not only for the conservation of biodiversity, but also in terms of biomass energy production. So basically, we know that these policies ask from forests a lot, multiple and diverse functions, among which there can be some relevant trade-offs. So for instance, depending on how much timber is harvested in forest, we may have at different levels of other functions fulfilled. And this is a recent article that tries to reconcile these functions and we ask ourselves, is it really possible to save the goat and the cabbage? But also what we ask when we read this kind of articles is what is the cabbage that we are going to save? Because for instance, in this very good article, biodiversity is proxied by the quantity of coarse woody debris of large trees or by the uneven structure of the forest. So there is not direct information on biodiversity here. And this is true in many studies when we have forest biodiversity in the title, but we do not find information on species other than trees within the article. Also on very prestigious journals or in very prestigious projects. And this is not only a cultural attitude, but is also linked to the fact that often biodiversity is assessed and evaluated through some indicators, indirect indicators of biodiversity. These are the most commonly used, for instance, stand structure, the deadwood, other data that we may retrieve from national forest inventories, or more recently, tree-related microhabitats. Stand structure is known to be a complex indicator for forest biodiversity because different groups of organisms react differently to different structural attributes, or also react with different with different strengths. And this is true, for instance, for the forest in the German Biodiversity Exploratories Network. It was also found in Denmark forest, and was also what we found in Apenninic beech forest. Here we only found deadwood to be a relevant indicator for multi-taxon biodiversity. If we look at deadwood, we can rely on a meta-analysis, for instance, for European forest, in which it was found that yes, deadwood is a good indicator for saproxylic species, but always with moderate coefficient, so with moderate strength in the links with biodiversity. So this said, it was our question in the very beginning of our story, to ask, but is it so difficult to put together some actual biodiversity data to cope with the questions that are posed by the different policies in Europe? And we started this journey long before the beginning of the cost actions, because we were in contact since at least 2013 with Yoan Paillet and Peter Odor, and we already tried to enlarge our network before the beginning of the action that was then funded and started in 2019. As you know, the cost actions are networking actions, networking projects. So we put our efforts in putting together large networks of researchers, more than 300 from 36 countries. We organized and participated to conferences, organized training schools, also in collaboration with other cost actions, and enforced our network through scientific missions and grants. But our action was not only about networking, because we had also a very concrete goal that was to put together and harmonize the data on multi-taxon forest biodiversity that came from different local projects, national projects, and to put together not only the biodiversity data, but also stand structure data and management data. In the initial version of the database, we now have 34 datasets harmonized that cover 12 countries and have a total of 3,500 sampling units. If I have to mention the strengths and weaknesses of our database, I would say that one strength is certainly that we did not harmonize aggregated data, like for instance basal area or species richness, but we harmonized the raw data, so in the individual species records and the individual measurements of tree diameters and of deadwood fragments length, etc. While among the weaknesses, I may mention the fact that there are very few data in Southern Europe. So there are some categories of forests like Mediterranean or Thermophilus decidus forest that are not well represented in our database. Another strength of the database is the fact that we associated each sampling unit to a management regime. And this is not always the case in biodiversity database. So this is something that makes our database really unique. But it's not, it was not easy to achieve this goal because silvicultural strategies are linked to many local traditions in Europe and are also interpreted differently across different regions and countries. So this harmonization of the terms that were used across our network and in the literature was delivered also as an article by our colleague, led by our colleague Giovanni Trentanovi. Overall, the database was presented in an article that had 138 co-authors, so a really broad effort to present this platform. Covered several taxonomic groups, but from now on, I will refer to 6 taxonomic groups that are those for which we have more data, that are vascular plants, epiphytic bryophytes and lichens, birds, and saproxidic fungi and beetles. The first effort that I want to try to describe very briefly here is how we tried to inform management strategies. One of these efforts was led by our group at Sapienza, by the PhD student Lorenzo Balducci, that starting from the raw structural data, assessed the carbon stocks of each individual sampling unit, trying to answer the question if high carbon stock and high biodiversity can be achieved in the same forest stand. So we link the carbon stocks in forest to species richness. And we found that the carbon in the standing living trees, that is the indicator, I would say, most often used to assess carbon stocks, are weakly linked to the species richness of different taxonomic groups, also with some negative relationship. While if we look at the carbon stocks within the deadwood, we see stronger links that are positive for fungi, lichens, and beetles, for instance. Another approach that we used more at the landscape scale was about trying to apply the triad framework, which recognizes that in each forest landscape we have intensively managed, extensively managed, and set aside forests, to see if this was in a way a possible framework for forest planning in Europe. So we selected the sites in which we have at least represented 2 of these management intensities and resampled the data to create some virtual landscapes that add different shares of the 3 management intensities in this framework. What we found is that for all taxonomic groups, with the exception of vascular plants, the maximum gamma diversity was reached where we have in virtual landscapes with at least 50% of unmanaged forest. I have to say this effort was led by Rémi Duflo with the support of Steffi Heinrichs and Peter Schall. And if we look at the multi-taxon diversity index, we see that, yes, we need a lot of unmanaged forests in a virtual landscape to have the maximum biodiversity, and also that extensively managed forests do not contribute much to the gamma diversity of these landscapes. We also focused on forest understory, functional structure, and we focused on 2 indicators especially. So the functional diversity of understory that refers to the ability of the understory to respond to a broad range of environmental conditions and disturbance, and the functional redundancy that refers to the possibility of the species with the same function that can be replaced by other species in the same forest ecosystems. What we found here is that the most intensively managed forests like clear-cut or coppice forest have a low functional diversity, so may respond to a limited range of environmental conditions and changes in disturbance regime, for instance, but have a higher functional redundancy, so have many species that perform the same role within the forest. There was also an entire working group dedicated to another set of data that were not only observational, but were experimental data. So based on forest manipulation experiments that used the multi-taxon biodiversity to monitor the effect of different treatments. This effort was the one led by Flora Tinya, that is with us today. The vast majority of the case studies that we were able to find were about thinning and gap cutting. And so we focused on these 2 kinds of treatments to go for further analysis. And we found that we harmonized the biodiversity data across these 14 experiments, and we found that gap creation and thinnings may be beneficial to the species richness of subroxilic beetles and vascular plants. We then focused also on biodiversity indicators to test if the indicators that were so complex at the local scale may be relevant by upscaling our analysis. Actually, we found, for instance, for stem structure, and this is an effort led by the student Lucas Choinaki, that is co-supervised with the Wageningen University, had a very different response to some basic structural attributes such as basal area or tree density. or in some cases, no significant response at all. We also focused on deadwood, and this is an effort led by Inke and Dörfler, and we tried to assess the deadwood amount that is needed in a forest to guarantee high levels of biodiversity in relation to this structural attribute. For instance, we found that for lying deadwood volume, we would need about 70 cubic meters to have relevant advantages for multi-taxon biodiversity. We see here that all these results on the right are those based on biodiversity data, and in fact are in line with our results. While this is very different from the amount of deadwood that is recommended in the Natura 2000 sites, for instance. So there is a big gap between what is recommended in management and what is actually relevant for biodiversity conservation. Another effort that was performed within the action was led by Yoan Paillet, that is also with us today, and was aimed at testing the effectiveness of the indicators for biodiversity maintenance that are used by Forest Europe for the reports on the state of Europe forest. It is to be said that these indicators are mostly tree-based, or in some cases are based on variables that are quantified at the landscape scale. It is also to be said that Forest Europe is already aware of the need to revise these indicators, and there is a process already going on in this direction. So what we found is that only some of these indicators are relevant for biodiversity and only for some taxonomic group, also in this case. But more importantly, we found that the coefficients that link these indicators to biodiversity are very, very weak. So again, we have a situation in which we don't have a certainty about the effectiveness of these indicators. And we really hope that in the revision process that will be performed by Forest Europe, some actual biodiversity data will be accounted for to test for the new indicators, because they are put in place. Our effort was also aimed at creating some standard protocols for the future studies, and we analyzed and discussed within our network all the protocols that were used in our projects, and averaged them in some protocols that we proposed in a scientific paper, but also in a more user-friendly book, obviously downloadable and free to use. And we also tried to assess what would be a fair sampling effort to assess forest biodiversity at the European level. We could do this only for some forest categories because we didn't have data for, as I said, Thermophilus or Mediterranean forest categories. And we found that the effort can be different for different taxonomic groups, but also across different spatial scales. For instance, some taxonomic groups would need a high number of sites to be sampled, but within these sites may need a relatively low number of sampling units. So coming to my conclusions and also to the conclusions of the cost action, we created 2 policy briefs that are going to be officially delivered when all the articles that I mentioned will be completely published. We think that it is really relevant to define some clear conservation goals to know which taxonomic groups and in some cases which species we want to conserve, because it's very difficult to say that we aim at conserving biodiversity in general. It would be also useful to create a mosaic of differently managed forests, because this can support different qualities of the biodiversity and on the functional diversity of forest. But anyway, we should ensure the diffuse occurrence of unmanaged forest through our forest landscape. And especially in extensively managed forest, we should try to release relevant deadwood quantities for biodiversity. In terms of indicators and monitoring, we think it's time to fund a coordinated monitoring network for biodiversity that should be designed based on the existing data, so on the diversity patterns of the different taxonomic groups that we may derive from the data that already exist. And we should have a clear focus on thermophilous forests that are also those more threatened by some changes in climate. And we also would like to provide support to the revision of indicators of sustainable forest management for biodiversity. Relatively to this last point, we all know that there is a proposal for a forest monitoring law that is being discussed, and that the main goal of this proposal is to provide high quality monitoring to track the progress that EU is making also in terms of biodiversity conservation. And we are studying very carefully the annexes of this proposal, and we see that at the European Commission level, no biodiversity data are being collected. Some indicators are being studied and explored by the member states, but most biodiversity data that you see here in green are put off to a stepwise process with some uncertain timeline. And so we are very worried about this, and we also are trying to produce a perspective paper to contribute to the discussion on this proposal. And with this, I conclude. I really want to thank the Superb project for the invitation, and you for your attention. I want to thank all the participants to the cost action, and most of all the core group that was really crucial to achieve these results that I presented today. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabina. I would like to also now invite the other panelists to the floor, and I would like to introduce my co-moderator, Andreas Bolte. I'm sorry I didn't mention you in the beginning, but I think most of the participants already know you. He was the leader of the former IU4 task force, and will still be my co-moderator for today. And I've also, while you were talking, I've checked the list of participants of this webinar, and there are many people that you mentioned in your presentation and that you gave credit to actually also in the webinar today, which is super nice, because then they, in case there's a question that cannot be answered in the panel, we can also invite just the other colleagues from Bottoms Up to respond to that. Okay, so I have a couple of questions that came to my mind. I cannot see any in the chat right now, so I would just like to kick it off. And I would like to start with a kind of overall challenge of Bottoms Up, which was to gather comparable biodiversity data. And it is called Bottoms Up because it was really a bottoms up approach, which is not the case for every project. So I think it's something that really sticks out. And you already kind of referred to that in the presentation, but I want to ask again, how did you deal with the diversity of the local terms and also the different interpretation in various languages? You also mentioned the indicators, and I know it's even a challenge to translate the indicators to different languages or to have a common understanding. So how did you deal with the diversity of case studies, etc., and how did you harmonize that in the end? You can just, like, whoever is on the panel can respond to that question. It doesn't necessarily need to be Sabina. Who wants to kick it off? Okay.
I can reply if you want.
Yes,
I was
please.
waiting just if someone else wanted to
intervene.
So yes, language problems, as I said, were mostly related to the management information, because it's really linked to some local traditional approach, and in some cases the terms were maybe comparable, but they were very differently interpreted by the participants in our network. So that was really, I would say, the hardest part. While for the biodiversity data, there are some standard nomenclatures, and also means to automatically go through these nomenclatures and harmonize them. And we also had a nice team of taxonomists that double checked all the nomenclatures and of the species in the database. So these were the means through which we harmonize this, let's say, language part.
Thank you very much. I think Andreas has another or follow-up question. Please go ahead. We can make this super interactive. I mean, everyone can just talk. I'm not expecting everyone to talk at the same time, so just feel free to speak out, even if I don't announce you.
Yeah, thank you, Keshe. At first, thank you very much, Sabina, I think, for this super interesting overview. And this is particularly interesting for me because for, I think, 2.5 years, we're trying to set up a new forest biodiversity monitoring system for Germany on a national level. I know that also colleagues at INRAE do in the same way also for France. So, and remembering also the discussion what we have also with some experts like, also Peter Schall and others, was also the question we're trying to come not from just more or less assessing biodiversity or count different taxa, but also coming more or less from the management side. So to say what can management and what management can contribute to a increase of biodiversity for the different specific species groups and so on. And this is also one question I would like to ask you, because I think it's very well known that amount of deadwood and I think old growth structures are valuable for biodiversity, but thinking in particular on managed forests, do you also include something like, I think it's also introduced Forest Management Index for me or others, which also differentiate between kind of management intensity. But often I see also from literature, you see the more or less old growth or more or less untouched forest, and on the other side also the managed forest. But there's a great diversity of management strategies and intensity. And this is also one point I would like to ask you: do you also include an idea how to include different management intensity into biodiversity monitoring? Whoever wants to answer the question.
Maybe you need to appoint one.
Yeah, I was thinking perhaps on Sabina, because I think you have a good overview about on the European level.
Yes, from my point of view, it would be nice if we could use also information on different management systems to design our monitoring network. So to balance different kind of management in the monitoring of biodiversity. The problem is that there is not such good spatial information on the distribution of different management systems in Europe. I don't know, maybe at the national level some countries have, but at the European level still it is not really well known how the different management systems are distributed. So this could really help to have a good information of biodiversity in the different managed system. In general, I can say that also in all biodiversity research, it was not easy to retrieve the management data, because sometimes they are very fragmented, also locally, and in some cases owners are not willing to share them. So having a management information associated with our sampling units was one of the most difficult tasks that we had to face. And we only could have some general management information, and were not able in many cases to have information about, for instance, last intervention, intensity of the last intervention. This was very hard to get. So I think the first step would be to have some public databases of this management information at the national and then also at the European level, because that would really make our work easier.
Perhaps one remark. One possibility could be also a closer or a collaboration between the European network of national forest inventories. I know that some of the national forest inventories have no open access to the data. This is perhaps also one problem, but this is something we also try to do on our national level, because you already showed more or less also the article of Felix Storch, and that we try more or less to get this link from more or less biodiversity data to the habitat structures, but also include also NTU's national forest inventory data to assess the forest intensity, at least for more or less the last 2 or 3 decades. I know that's also sometimes a long-term history, which is then difficult to assess, but perhaps this could be also one idea to get a link to this national forest inventory data. And I guess in many European countries, especially in Scandinavia, where we're a long-term data series, but of course there are sometimes problems because they are not open to everyone.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. And also, I think Sabina mentioned that there are some countries that, or some regions that provided more data, and that data, for example, from the south of Europe was a bit more difficult to collect, if I remember that correctly. John wanted to complement. Please go ahead.
Yeah. On the management and the old growth structure, I think one of the outcome of the project is that what can promote biodiversity at the landscape scale is the mix of management types, and this is the main results of what was shown by the German colleagues and the work on the triad types of management, which is very interesting, I think. But for me, it also depends outside of the management types on what you promote as an old-growth structure in each management types. For example, how much deadwood you can promote in an even-age or uneven-age forest is probably much more important than the way you manage the forest. This is not the main outcome of this project, but when we look at the biodiversity data, then we see that generally the effect of forest structures, especially deadwood, of course, but also tree-related microhabitat, large trees, and so on, are much more important than management types, because within one management types you have several ways, and depending on the country, several ways of accepting what is even-age or uneven-age forest whatsoever. So for me, the importance is to preserve structures at the local scale, and diversity of management types at the landscape scale. And one final point is that some thresholds, that was the work done coordinated by Inken Dorfler, show that there are some levels of these structures that can be found only in forest reserves. So one landscape needs a large part, we don't know yet what is large, but large part of forest reserve that can preserve large amounts of favorable forest structures.
Thank you very much, and Flora immediately complementing that. Thank you.
Yes, I also thank for the invitation to this webinar, and I just would like to say just a small compliment to the words of Sabina and Yoan. because as Sabina mentioned, I was leading a working group in this project which investigated the effect of forest management on forest biodiversity on with another approach than the observational studies of Sabina's group, because we were working with forestry experiments. And a big advantage of this approach was that we could directly study the effect of different forest management actions on forest biodiversity. Of course, it was not at landscape scale, and we could not study the effect of the whole systems, management systems, but the effect of the given interventions like a gap cutting or a thinning could be much better studied, because in a standardized experiment, this effect could be separated better from other effects on the forest biodiversity.
Thank you. And that's of course then, and that's what I understood from what Sabina's presentation. That's also, of course, a better condition to provide then real guidance for practitioners. We can say we really investigated, it's not theoretical knowledge, but we actually looked at the effects, and that of course gives you much more credibility than if everything is just in theory, because we working with practitioners, they also, I mean, they are very aware of the different local conditions, and if they're happy to receive guidance. That's at least our experience, but they really want the kind of more hands-on approaches. So that's, I think, something also particular about your project. Now I want to invite one of the participants to ask his question live. Alex Bush is a colleague from Superb, and you have the floor, Alex. Go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for the presentation, Sabina. And amazing project. Way too much information to absorb this quickly. And I think you mentioned interactions among the groups, but do any of the groups show a common response? Like, are fungi and saproxylic beetles doing an approximately similar response, even if they're not responding to structure? Was that at least something that was consistent?
Yes, I think some consistencies was there, but we also tried to be as finely accurate as possible. So, for instance, as for the carbon stocks, while saproxylic fungi were more favored by lying deadwood, for saproxylic beetles, it was a standing deadwood that in our database resulted as a key habitat. Obviously, we think that lying deadwood would be good for saproxylic beetles as well, but this also depends on the data from which we started, that were mostly managed forests with relatively low amounts of lying deadwood. So for this reason, it may be that for instance, the beetle response did not come out. So I think, yes, some similarities may be found, and some structures may be good for more than one taxonomic groups. In general, the vascular plants are those that seem to be favored in terms of species richness by younger forests, but this we all know. What we want to do next is also to differentiate among species, forest species, non-forest species, or to account also for functional traits of the species, so that we may also discuss these differences and understand better which are also the similarities.
To be clear, I wasn't really focusing on the beetles and the fungi. It was more, if we can't shortcut indicators of biodiversity using structure and function, can we measure some of the groups as proxies for the other groups? I know that's dangerous, and your answer should be no, but ish.
I can say that we haven't really tried with this data across taxon analysis. So we went more towards links with structure and management, and we haven't looked at cross-taxon relationship in depth. So this is certainly something that we can do in the future.
Thank you. And Geshe, I have one more because I'm here. In Superb, we've been discussing whether we should incentivize action and types of management action with the assumption that it will lead to get benefits, or whether we should be monitoring result. Payment should be sort of awarded based on results, particularly for biodiversity. Would anybody disagree that the results of bottoms up suggests that it's very much results would be the best way to go? Or is there a sort of case also for some action based incentives as well?
Who wants to go? Or should Alex rephrase the question?
It was a long question.
Make it
if we
shorter.
pay foresters, should we pay them to do things, or should we pay them to deliver biodiversity that we can monitor and show results?
I would go for the second. And I think all the studies on this topic, also relative to the agricultural policy, for instance, point towards results-driven incentives. And we hope that this is the way that sooner or later we will take.
And so hopefully it will be comforting to you that our recent meeting, we managed to convince, should we say, EU agencies of a similar kind of argument that, yeah, results-based was the way to go, and a network of a database of harmonized monitoring was probably necessary.
Yeah, we are here to support in case.
That's good to know. And we didn't have doubts about that. Yeah, and I think we also had this internal discussion that maybe there should be kind of a first trigger for incentives, and then more of the money should come after the kind of seeing the effects. Because if they don't get any incentives in the beginning, then it can be a bit challenging. But then to kind of have the two perspectives and to cut the funding in the middle in a way. So, but I'm looking forward to hearing more from Alex on that in a different meeting, because that's really, there was a meeting I was not attending. Yoan, you wanted to complement or contribute as well. Please go ahead.
Yeah, only on the taxonomic part. I don't think measuring only one taxa for all the others is a good solution, but still we see that the taxa that are more linked with the substrates, like lichens, fungi, and bryophytes, they are more responsive to those structures, obviously, but they are also the less studied compared to birds and vascular plants. So maybe if we have to monitor some species, at least one of those groups would be interesting, because they are at stake for a global change, of course, but also for they appear to be responsive. So maybe a good idea.
Thanks. Andreas, please.
Yeah, just perhaps also to complement. I guess I would suggest not to think about either or. I think it would be really nice to, if you have opportunities to assess more or less or directly assess taxa. I think this is, of course, I think this should be done, but in some cases thinking about soil biodiversity, so you completely get lost. I think then there might be also some options or possibility to think about what you said, Alex, proxies. So something about, are there any habitats or microhabitat structures which can be linked more or less in a fuzzy way, I think, to the abundance or the diversity of specific taxa, because at the end, and this is something also thinking about our biodiversity monitoring approach, there was a clear idea from practitioners, but also from the policy to say please indicate also some effect of the management. It's of course not only by doing shelter wood system or clear cut, but also how many old trees should be left, how many how many microhabitat structures should be preserved, and what about lying, standing deadwood and something like this. And this is not directly linked more or less to the abundance of a specific species, but more or less trying to preserve the habitats. And I think that it might be also a certain way a combination of course the really sound scientific approach of getting more or less the idea of the diversity of the taxa or the biodiversity in general, but also on to thinking about what are the preserving of the structures which should be preserved to more or less establishing habitats and developing habitats. I think that might be a combination. So I would be reluctant to say this is the right way or that is the right way, thinking of biodiversity monitoring. So, but something like an inclusion of, I think, several approaches.
Thanks. There's nuance to this. Thank you.
Thank you very much then for enriching the discussion, Alex. We have another question in the Q&A, and that is related to the increase in the amount of dead biomass in the forest. And the question is, did you observe an increase also in the number of pests when the amount of dead biomass in the forest was increased? It's a very specific question, and I wonder if any one of you has an answer to that.
What I can say is that there is a paper that is now being revised by our group after major revisions request, in which it was clear that comparing managed with unmanaged forest, non-native beetles, I don't know if not pests, but non-native beetles in general, were more abundant in managed than in unmanaged forests. So this is not a direct reply to this question, but I think is related, and that we can say that in some conditions is not deadwood that causes pests.
Yeah, that's I think a very big concern actually of forest managers as well. I've heard that several times in the past. So I think this paper will, or a kind of a short summary of the paper, I think will then be quite encouraging for those who should implement the management for increased biodiversity in the forest. I have another question related to that, because I was wondering, you told about the kind of policy recommendations that you provide after the relevant papers are published, and or the recommendations for decision makers. And I was wondering, in case we don't get, or in case kind of payment for biodiversity schemes is not coming soon, or not coming to the extent that forest owners, for instance, would need it to really compensate for the reduced wood production. I was wondering what other incentives would be there based on your work that you identified for forest owners, for instance, to take measures towards more biodiversity conservation, like lying, standing deadwoods, microhabitat protection, etc. What other incentives, if there are no financial incentives, maybe in terms of increasing forest resilience, or increasing maybe also the quality of the wood, or other incentives kind of beyond financial ones? Maybe I can ask Yoan or Flora.
The point is that we were mainly or almost exclusively ecologists in the bottoms-up panel, so we didn't have this. We didn't get the point to this reflection on incentive and the motivation of private owners and managers. Unfortunately, in the cost action, there are some stakeholders that should be involved in the action, but at some point the final conference triggered some discussions on that, but still that was the final conference, and we didn't get this point. There will need, I think, more discussion and probably other types of projects involving local stakeholders to answer those questions.
Thanks. I mean, they could certainly use the data that you produced for the follow-up. I have another question related to the kind of bottom-up approach of bottoms-up and the huge amount of field data that you generated. And I was wondering how that can effectively complement the top-down biodiversity data that is collected, like, for instance, through remote sensing. And if that was a kind of topic that you discussed in the project, and if you have any follow-up plans on that.
We did not try this kind of analysis. Sure, we think there could be a complement. Based on my experience on these data, I don't think that we may find some remotely sensed indicators of biodiversity. And this is also because we use the very fine scale that is also good to have at the stand level, in addition to the landscape level. But surely complementing, and especially I'm thinking of more accurate satellite data can help us also in design and our sampling throughout forest types, forest categories. I think this can be also a good guidance for biodiversity monitoring.
Yeah, thank you very much. So lots of angles that could be used for a follow-up. There's a question in the chat, and I wanted Yoan to ask it live. So please go ahead, and because you've raised your hand since a while. Yoan is the coordinator of Superb. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I assume you hear me now.
We do.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, thanks, Sabina, for your presentation. There's indeed a wealth of information there. And you mentioned then at the end to coordinate this more direct biodiversity monitoring with in a more organized setup, maybe combine that with coordinate with national forest inventories. That's a massive change if the national forest inventories have to start monitoring biodiversity as well. And well, you know, butterflies and plants, and they all have their seasonal aspects and are now monitored by a volunteer group, usually volunteer networks in the countries. How do you see that this can work?
I think it would be great if we managed to have some volunteer work, but I also have to say that when we look into biodiversity, it's good to have also a good quality of the data, and it's easy to have this quality lowered by different observers. Surely, I think that the new tools that we have, from AI to genomic analysis, would make much easier to incorporate some biodiversity analysis within forest inventories. Surely we have to think of some easy to detect and to sample maybe groups of species. so that this can be done on a very large scale.
Yeah.
Yoan, please.
Yeah, maybe what I can add is that voluntary-based data is complementary from professional gathered data, and we can have the example of Switzerland that combined the inventory plot, the forest inventory plots with their biodiversity monitoring scheme. So it's and it's very important to have the biodiversity and the forest structure sample at the same place. The point with the voluntary data is that there's some mismatch, spatial mismatch between the data that are gathered, and it blurs the message and it cannot be used properly. And I think there are some papers that show the complementarity of the two approaches, how voluntary massive data can complement very well the data from professionals and from science. Or maybe that's the solution, is kind of a combination of both.
Andreas, please.
Yeah, perhaps especially to Jan. But one idea could be if you can link more or less biodiversity to certain structural traits which are assessed in a national or in national forest national forest inventory, then there might be possible with all the problems that this this is very fuzzy approach, but of course I think this could be an idea to transfer or to link more or less direct biodiversity assessments to NFIs, even if there's no direct assessment of biodiversity, except of more or less tree biodiversity or something like this. And there are different traits, like more or less structural traits of the stands or bark traits and something like this. So I think there are different possibilities, and of course, not all species groups are sensitive to this, but some are sensitive. And I think even though, or with this, perhaps there might be also some approach. So I guess this is one idea, that it's not needed to do all of the assessment at the same place. It would be nice, but of course, on a national level, even not on a European level, I think that's not affordable.
Jan, do you have a response to that, or are you satisfied with the answer?
Yeah, it certainly satisfied, and of course good answers, but also very challenging, of course, to implement this in the field and really make that linkage between the different networks and the way of operating. And there's the plant, the vegetation sociologists, they are not interested in going to the same 20,000 plots every couple of years. They are interested in monitoring those very specific, very rare habitats, and they just go there, and that's what they want to follow. And there's different aims in all these networks. But I'm sure the people in here are well aware of that.
Thanks. Then I have a question related to the platform, which is enormous. You mentioned some really incredible numbers. So I was wondering if you, because the way I understood it is that the cost action has ended, but you are still publishing the papers and you still have activities that are ongoing. But I was wondering, what about the database? Are you planning to add new data to the database? How will you deal with that? Because I know that there are several projects in Europe that are currently collecting relevant data. So I was wondering how your approach is related to that. Maybe also interesting for some of the participants today.
Yes, with the, let's say, with the residual funds of the action, what we are now doing is to transform our database in an SQL database with some maybe stricter rules than we had in the beginning, and also the possibilities to have easier queries. So this is an important step for us. In the meanwhile, we already have some data sets in queuing to be included that we will use as a test for this new database structure. And we are also collecting additional data, the projects in which I'm involved, especially in the Mediterranean area. So yes, we are keeping up with the work. We hope that the database will be as much as possible easy to use in the near future, let's say by spring. And then we will start adding also new data, and we will be happy to have them added also from other groups.
So it will be possible for other groups to get access to the database, or would it run through you?
The access at the moment is a request that is submitted, and up to now we provided the data to all the colleagues that requested them. And then, yes, also that is a process, because we have to go through all the custodians and ask for completely open access. So it's something that will come in the future, but for now, we are replying to the individual requests of persons wanting to use the data.
Thank you. Perfect. I'm also away asking for a friend. Andreas, you have raised your hand. Otherwise, I have another question. But please, if you have a question, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Especially, I have also a question for Flora, because I'm really curious also in the results of this different management and gap openings and so on. And I was wondering, which are the factors which differentiate if you look on the different management system? Is it more or less light regime? Is it more below canopy temperature, or moisture or humidity, or something like this? Do you have some also information on this?
We couldn't investigate directly these drivers of the differences between the different management. So we have just metadata about which experiment collects data about the light conditions or soil moisture, or I don't know, other environmental conditions, but we didn't use this data in our analysis. So we can just suppose that of course, the light conditions, for example, for the vascular plants is a cardinal issue. And we found, for example, that if we compare the effects of the aggregated gap cutting and the even thinning, then usually the gap cutting has a stronger effect on the forest biodiversity, on the species richness than the even thinning. And I can suppose that it is because the environmental heterogeneity within the stand is higher in case of gap cutting, so much diverse so-called microhabitats or environmental conditions occur in this case. So both in light conditions and also in temperature and humidity and so on. But we didn't investigate it quantitatively.
Yeah, but those are definitely some recommendations already useful. Speaking of recommendations, you know that in Superb, and that was also, of course, the approach from the IUFO task force, we look at forest restoration, and in the case of Superb, also restoration in a combination with climate change adaptation. So forests that are in a degraded state, for instance, when they are restored, they are not restored to the former state or the state before the degradation, but actually climate change adaptation measures are kind of taken into account, as well as, of course, how to increase the biodiversity in the forest. And coming also from very practical experiences in our demo sites, where, for instance, monocultures are transformed into more mixed species forests, more mixed forest, or non-native forests are actually cut to, or they try to create more light. They create microhabitats in the forest. Through certain measures, bringing, etc. So I was wondering what we as a Superb project, including our 12th demo site, who actually do different restoration measures to increase biodiversity, but also resilience to climate change. What are the kind of key messages, or what are some lessons learned from the project that we could use for also our practitioners? I know you mentioned some in the presentation. Maybe you want to go back to those, but that would, I think, be really interesting also for those who work in Superb, and maybe also for colleagues from Andreas from the former task force. I know this is a big question, but I would like all of you to answer it.
Okay,
Sabina, you go first.
Yeah, I can go back to what I already mentioned in the presentation. We think that heterogeneity is the key to biodiversity. So heterogeneous structures, heterogeneous management types, and also focusing on those elements that are so rare in managed forests, like deadwood, for instance. These are the main outcomes that we had from our action. So and also the relevance of setting aside some areas to the natural development can be something relevant, also to have reference for future restoration projects.
Yes, thank you very much. That also, I think, reflects upon the kind of measures that the colleagues are already taking, but can maybe also complement. Yoan, can you complement something?
Yeah, maybe not, but maybe not a scientific answer, but for a forest manager, I guess the target is more deadwood, more microhabitats, more large trees, and yeah, because globally the levels that you can observe in managed forests are lesser than those needed by species. So I know it's not a really precise question, but any increase in those elements that are rare in forest management is beneficial to any biodiversity, even though we cannot measure really it.
Mm-hmm. I think this is exactly the recommendation that helps forest owners, or those who are not researching it, because it's something very practical. Flora,
sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, there was this book edited by the EFI in 2020 on examples of integrated forest management across Europe, and I remember one example in Germany where they tried things about deadwood, and they reached like 40 cubic meters per hectare, and they say, okay, at this point we cannot manage the forest if there's more deadwood, so that is our target. And this is a way to define target, like this is a utility threshold that cannot be, that is not scientific, it's very practical. And I think we have to discuss those thresholds at some point, and try to discuss among scientists, stakeholders, and what are acceptable thresholds, analytic scientific thresholds and other types of thresholds, and then decide what is better for biodiversity.
Thank you very much. Flora?
Yes, I can agree with Sabina that the heterogeneity is the key term in this question. We also found in our analysis that if we think about this homogeneous closed forest and we open this canopy, it usually helps to increase the species richness of many taxa, but not all of them. So all the taxa have a bit different response. And there are some ecological groups that are related to also to the closed forest. So it's also important that if we make any intervention or management, we should keep some parts of the stand intact, because it's also important to have these closed parts and undisturbed parts. And another thing that I would like to emphasize, that many response of the taxa takes longer time than, for example, some years. So in many cases, we didn't found a response, for example, to a canopy opening, a gap creation, but we can suppose that after some years or some decades, there will be some strong response even in these cases. So we have to be patient when we are waiting for the results of some management.
Thank you very much also for mentioning that, because that's often a problem in any type of project where also experiments are taking place, that actually in the forest you see the results usually not within 3 or 4 years, but within 5 or 10 if you are happy. And this also links to my, and that shows also the limits also of the research in those projects. And that links to my final question, if there are no further questions from the audience or from Andreas. What are kind of your follow-up activities? And maybe you can also all respond to that on the panel. What are you mentioned already the papers, etc., but how do you kind of continue the work in your current positions as researchers, as professors, etc.? What are your kind of follow-up activities after bottoms up? You want to go first, Sabina?
Yes, what we are doing, yes, we are collecting additional data through other projects, for instance, life projects. We are keeping up with the papers that we started and also starting new ones. We are writing new proposals for projects, also enlarging our network to forest economists, forest social experts. And this is how we would like to keep up with this work.
Thank you very much. Flora.
So in the framework of this bottom-up action, we finished our work practically, but as a next step, for example, we get to know some other, so we have a forest management experiment, and we get to know some other partners in Europe with which we started new projects, for example, an INRAE project. And I hope that in the framework of these cooperations, we can follow we can continue the common work.
Right, because go ahead.
Many projects and studies.
And this way you can also provide more the kind of long-term results and long-term monitoring that was not possible within the project duration, I guess. Yoan.
Yeah, within the framework of the project, we are also still working on the metrics of indicators of biodiversity. So we have the paper Sabina mentioned already that is about to be published, and we have other analyses ongoing on trying to improve indicators by using other metrics of diversity, of heterogeneity rather than abundance. So that will be the immediate follow-up of the project. And for me, it's also interesting to specify the links between to specify more the links between some part of biodiversity and some elements of forest structure, especially microhabitats. I like microhabitats, so I'm working on that.
Yeah, I like microhabitats too. And whenever I see one, I show my kids. Now, this is a microhabitat. So they keep collecting them in the forest now with me. Through all the integrative forest management work, I get really excited about and inspired by microhabitats. Before we close the webinar, I would like Andreas to announce the next webinar, because in the next webinar, he will not be there as a moderator, but actually as a speaker. So please, Andreas, announce the next session in December.
Yes, thank you, Geshe. It's a great pleasure for me now to contribute, not as a moderator, but also as a as a speaker. But it's not only me, but also but the PhD student I have the honor and the pleasure also to supervise, which is Alfred Aliji from Uganda, but he's working more or less on in a larger project in southern Ethiopia, and within the global assessment of FLR, we try to have a showcase here how we can assess former forest landscape restoration activities in terms of the success, not only in case of biophysical assets that the landscape restored areas are still there, but also the responses in the socioeconomic. So what are the local people are thinking about it? It's really a benefit. So this is more or less the framework. So there will be a general introduction from me, but then also some, I think, interesting data and also assessment from this showcase in the South Ethiopia.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for introducing the next session on the 11th of December. Then a big thank you to the panelists and presenters today. It's very great to hear that there will still be follow-ups from bottoms up, lots of research results that are about to be published. So everyone should follow the website, bottoms up. It's very easy to find. Bottoms up cost action. If you Google that, then you will find the website, and everything published is announced there. And then we're also eagerly waiting for the policy briefs, because those will certainly also be relevant for Superb. And I wish everyone a nice rest of the day. Let's keep in touch and keep up the good work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Geshe, for the moderation.
Bye. Bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.